man.
Good evening and welcome to the Crocker Art Museum. My name is Houghton Kinsman and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator here at the museum. Thank you all for being here for our guest lecture from Dr. Meghen Jones on the exhibition Hands in Earth, Contemporary Japanese Ceramics. I would like to begin proceedings by reading a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Crocker Art Museum is on the traditional land of the Nisenan people, and the current state of California is the homeland of many tribes. We are honored to be here today and acknowledge our responsibility to these Native nations and our commitment to work with them as we move forward as an inclusive institution. So as I mentioned earlier, tonight we'll hear from Dr. Meghen Jones, and her lecture begins where her catalogue essay, Materiality and the Language of Contemporary Japanese Ceramics, left off. Dr. Jones will share some insight into the specific works, explore materials and techniques used, and share some of the history connected to the arts in the exhibition. It promises to be fascinating. Tonight's program kicks off an exciting spring season of programs at the Crocker. Be sure to visit our website, crockerart.org, to plan your seasonal calendar. And if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube page, it's a great way to stay current with all our digital content and virtual programming. Now, before we introduce Dr. Jones, it's my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage the Crocker's Ruth Rippon Curator of Ceramics, Rachel Gottlieb. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Houghton. Great to be here. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Meghen Jones, who's Associate Professor of Art History in the School of Art and Design at New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. Alfred University is a leading school in the world for teaching studio ceramics. Her research centers on modern Japanese art, design, and the global flows of modern contemporary ceramics. Dr. Jones's most recent project has been guest curating and editing the catalog for the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum Path of the T-Bowl exhibition, which is on view until the end of March. So maybe at the end of this talk, she can share a little bit about this fascinating exhibition. She's also contributed to many publications, including an article on the National Treasure T-Bowls as a cultural icon in modern Japan in the journal The Construction and Dynamics of Cultural Icons, which was edited by Eric Van Boven and Marieke Winkler. She has co-edited with Louise Court, Ceramics and Modernity in Japan, which was published by Routledge in 2019. She's also written on the reception of Japanese pottery in the early Cold War in the United States for Design and Culture in 2017. So Professor Jones received her PhD in the history of art and architecture from Boston University in 2014. And her dissertation was on the modern ceramic artist Tomito Kenkichi. And prior to that, she completed a master's degree in ceramic craft design at forgive my pronunciation, at the Musashino Art University in Tokyo. And she also holds a BA in Japanese Studies and Fine Art from Earlham College. So it gives me great pleasure now to, we're going to hear Dr. Jones speak in a moment, but I now going to introduce a small video that will give you a taste of the exhibition if you haven't had a chance to see it. And it'll give you an overview and provide great context for Dr. Jones's talk. And I'll also say that if you have questions for Dr. Jones, please put it in the chat, and I will present those questions to her at the after her talk. Thanks so much for attending. Hi, I'm Rachel Gottlieb, Ruth Rippon Curator of Ceramics at the Crocker Art Museum. And I wanted to welcome you to the Hands in Earth exhibition that celebrates contemporary Japanese ceramics. We were very fortunate to be showing the collection of Carol and Jeffrey Horwitz. They are preeminent collectors based in Boston, and they have the largest collection of contemporary Japanese ceramics in the United States. So Hands on Earth is an amazing exhibition because it really shows the major impulses of Japanese ceramics in the 20th century. Firstly, it shows folk craft known as the Mingei movement, and secondly, it shows the sculptural turn and the influence of modernism on contemporary Japanese ceramic artists. Whether the work is functional or whether the work is sculptural, what you'll see in this exhibition is a commitment to excellence in craft. This video that you're going to see gives you an overview of the trends of modern and contemporary Japanese ceramics. I think it'll give you a real taste for the show, which will give you context for our upcoming talk by Professor Meghen Jones from Alfred University. And I do urge you to come and see the exhibition. It's up until April 2nd. Okay, so I guess we're now ready to hear Dr. Jones's lecture. And I remind everyone that please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of the talk. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Houghton, for the invitation to speak today, and greetings everyone tuning in. The Contemporary Japanese Ceramics in the Hands on Earth exhibition offers such a prismatic view of the field with varied and compelling expressions of materiality and memory. I wrote a short essay, as Houghton mentioned, on materiality for the catalog, and the catalog is available at the museum or online through the University of Miami's open access repository. You see on its cover the artist Kondo Takehiro's stunning monolith of marbleized porcelain with cast glass. Kondo titled this Jishinha, or seismic wave. The works I'm about to show you embody cultural memories of past ceramics that, like seismic waves, energetically ripple across contemporary practice. We'll be looking at works mostly made in central Honshu, Japan's largest island. And many of the artists are based in or near Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital. It's important to note that the dialogue with the past we'll see is not only with Japan's past, but the complex histories of Japanese ceramics in relation to China and Korea, sources of so much material and technical know-how for Japanese potters over time. And this map points to the sheer number and modern continuations of local potteries throughout Japan. Its artist, Serizawa Keisuke, was a leader of the Minge or folk craft movement that Rachel mentioned. This was a movement that popularized the appreciation of functional everyday pottery, not only in Japan, but internationally. One of the reasons Japan has had such a thriving history of ceramics is due to these regional specializations that developed according to patronage by domain lords over the centuries and through the 19th century. I'd like to think tonight about two themes circulating in the exhibition. First, how is material expressed? How do artists make meaning out of clay, glaze, and fire? The phrase sozai o ikasu, which means making the most of materials, is important. Another way this phrase is expressed is through one of the major tenets of modernism globally. You may have heard the phrase truth to materials. The ceramics critic, historian, and curator Kaneko Kenji has famously put forth that materials and processes, what he calls craftical formation, comprise the very meaning of so much craft work in Japan today. And the second theme I'd like to explore is how is history expressed? Japan is one of the few countries in the world today that actively preserves the history of ceramics technical knowledge through giving prestigious awards that include financial support to individuals so that they can teach techniques to future generations. And so to explore materiality and history, let's look at three major genres in the exhibition: jars, tea vessels, and objet. Objet is from the French objet d'art, which means in Japan from the 1950s onward, modern ceramic sculpture, usually on the scale of a vessel. So here we are with jars. Jars are amongst the first ceramic forms we find in the world, and they're used for both cooking and for food or liquid storage. In Japan, by around the 5th century, very durable stoneware jars fired around 1100 to 1200 degrees Celsius were produced, and these were much stronger than previous earthenwares and were importantly impervious to water. Here, note the bold and somewhat exaggerated qualities of these modern Japanese examples that look to works from the past, particularly works from the Momoyama period of the late 16th century for stylistic and technical inspiration. Note that they all have shoulders tapering to more narrow bases and volumetric interiors that are slightly distorted and asymmetrical. It's as if these vessels have all inhaled deeply. For centuries in Japan, potters have used high heat produced from burning wood to transform soft clay to molten, crusty, scorched hardness, recorded in the kiln and called yohen or kiln change, when the glaze significantly alters and varies over the course of firing. Jars in Japanese are termed tsubo, which we can translate also as vessel or pot. The character tsubo derives from the ancient Chinese word hu, a wine storage vessel. And the word tsubo in Japanese can also mean point, target, or essence, and that suggests a sort of homonymic resonance. A jar, a tsubo, indeed seems to suggest the essence, tsubo, of ceramic vessel form. While historically jars would have been used for a range of food and beverage purposes, collectors, I should add, covet vessels like these for their artistry. And we see in Japan many vessels like these being used for flowers. These jars literally embody the material of particular locales, clays, and processes associated with certain places. In these cases, Mashiko for Hamada, Iga for Kishimoto and Watanabe, and for Tsujimura, who makes his work in Nara, he uses nearby Shigaraki clays and processes. The taste and flavor of wines according to region or terroir is a useful paradigm or comparison for approaching the study of these historically, locally rooted vessels. Hamada Shoji, the most prominent ambassador to the US of Japanese folkcraft ceramics, we see on the right at ease applying surface decoration to his pots while his cats are in the background. He famously relied on local Mashiko clays and glaze components, reflecting the folkcraft movement's favoring of the local. As a student, he'd gained expertise in glaze chemistry, but his mature pottery had a limited palette of glazes, all derived from natural local sources. Here, he used local wood ash to make a glaze with very high viscosity, the runniness of which is arrested by two horizontal ridges, like a dam for water, coloring the jar's neck and shoulder. In Japanese, this glaze is called ameyu and closely relates to precedents made in Joseon Dynasty, Korea. Japanese Mingei movement collectors sought out works like this during the period of Japan's colonization of Korea from 1910 to 1945, and within the negative colonialist contexts of primitivist aesthetics that highlighted ceramics' imperfections. Mingei followers praised the expression of beauty produced by an external power, a Taoist notion of the self in unison with forces of nature. Here we see on the right, Hamada's kiln, and on the left, I think we'll see in a moment, an image of Hamada throwing on the potter's wheel. He threw on the potter's, a Chinese chestnut hand wheel by putting the bulb end of a wooden stick into one of 4 holes on top. And that type of wheel was introduced from South China and first used at medieval Mino and Seto kilns in Japan. On the right, we see his wood-fueled climbing kiln, or noborigama. Heat from below starts at a fuel hole at the base and moves upward through a series of chambers over the long course of multiple days' firing. And this style of kiln was first used in China and by the 17th century in Japan. It has a huge capacity and regulates heat according to the needs of the potter. In the case of Hamada, a temperature of about 1100 degrees Celsius. Hamada said of his large kiln, "If a kiln is small, I might be able to control it completely. When I work at the large kiln, the power of my own self becomes so feeble that I cannot control it adequately." And he goes on, "Without the mercy of such invisible power, I cannot get good pieces." Another potter active in the Mingei movement was Kawai Kanjuro, who also channeled Korean Joseon Dynasty precedents. Kawai was more experimental than Hamada, here using a slip trailing technique in Japanese called ichin to make the surface design. And in East Asia, such techniques are relatively new, dating to the Ming Dynasty in China. In the 1920s and 30s, slip trailing became popular amongst modern Mingei potters who were inspired by medieval English slipware they had learned about, in part, from British potter Bernard Leach. Kawai's huge 8-chamber kiln was used co-op style by several groups in Kyoto until the early 1970s, when air pollution laws did not allow it. The kiln and his home are preserved today in a museum that's overseen by his granddaughter. And note the straw rope across the kiln. It's called a shimenawa. This denotes the sanctity and purity of the space dedicated to fire. Now we turn to a jar by Kishimoto Kennin that channels Iga-ware from the Momoyama period in the late 16th century, when Iga became a major ceramics production center, and its style became popular amongst practitioners of tea. Note the carved incised lines on the shoulder. Note the wood firing recordings and feldspar starbursts throughout. The surface ranging from scorched orange red clay to highly viscous green ash glaze. There's just so much going on. Like Hamada and Kawai, this artist shares a Buddhist underpinning to his work philosophy. He says he was greatly inspired by the wooden icons of the 17th century itinerant Buddhist sculptor Enku, known for his massive production and unostentatious direct expression, as we see here in a representation of the Wisdom King, Fudo Myo, who cuts through illusions and is also a guide for the deceased. A former owner named the work on the right Yabure Bukuro, or burst bag, for its cracks that occurred during what was likely multiple firings of high heat. Such repaired cracks became highly prized according to the aesthetics of tea developed around the late 16th century onward. These aesthetics favored simplicity, humbleness, irregularity, and stark beauty, within a more spiritual search, we might say, for meaning. Kishimoto says he has the greatest respect for historical Iga-ware in terms of this sort of spirituality and its sense of atmosphere. I also want to add that 400-year-old vessels like the Iga-ware work on the right, that's known as Ko-Iga or Old Iga, evoke what the writer Kawabata Yasunari said in his Nobel Prize speech. He said that the old Iga best embodies the aesthetic of wabi-sabi, the beauty of simplicity and weathered materials. Kishimoto has shown multiple times at the Japan Traditional Koge or Craft Exhibition. This was established in 1954 and financially supported by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs. The organization of 1,200 members promotes craft techniques, preservation, transmission, and exhibition, including works by living national treasures, as they're known colloquially. According to the organizers, tradition is a living, flowing thing that has an eternal essence that never stops. Like Kishimoto's jar, this one is also from Iga. Watanabe Aiko uses a hand wheel to build up coils of clay and fires her vessels in an anagama, a style of through-draft kiln used in Korea and then introduced to Japan during the Kofun period. That was the 4th to early 8th century. Anagama literally means whole kiln and is built partly underground on the side of the hill. And as you can see, it's made of bricks covered with clay. Potters generally alternate the placement of wood into the kiln such that there are oxidation and reduction atmospheres in alteration, like breathing, Watanabe says. The ash from the burning wood settles on the surface of the pot. She studied painting at Art University and looks to her childhood in Sakai City, where there were so many historical kiln sites, she says, as an inspiration. There are very few women who've achieved recognition in Japan for wood firing, Koyama Kyoko being another exception in Shigaraki. And in the case of Watanabe, she was not from a ceramics family. She didn't undergo a traditional apprenticeship. Instead, she trained with her high school art teacher, a potter in Shigaraki who had an anagama kiln. Watanabe looks to the ethos of work famously promoted by Mingei potter Kawai Kanjiro, whose work I just showed you. And she points to this important phrase by Kawai. Life is work, work is life. Everything will come out in the work itself, she says, and her goal is to make, as she puts it, honest pieces. Here are recent posters for Watanabe's solo exhibitions at the Kobe and Osaka Hankyu department store art galleries. Channeling forms that date back centuries, she makes a range of vessel types, including tea bowls, and she is a practitioner of the Omotesenke tea school. Tsujimura Kai, based in Nara and one of two sons of acclaimed potter Tsujimura Shiro, uses, like his father, the dynamic vocabulary of early wood-fired natural ash glaze styles, Iga as well as Shigaraki. Here the vessel was placed such that the ash glaze dripped diagonally. And this brings to mind this really bold sueware piece from the late 6th century in the Metropolitan Museum. It was fired in an onigama, and one of many produced by professional potters, possibly immigrants from the Kaya region of Korea, who worked in the region south of Osaka, not so far from Tsujimura's workshop. Vessels like these record the movement of ash in rivulets across surfaces, according to the vessel's placement in the kiln. For Tsujimura, the two disc shapes record what the glaze went around. Was it another vessel, a wad of clay, or a kiln prop? The result can be read as a kind of landscape, or kishki. What kind of landscape do you see? Now let's turn to other tsubo-type forms, both made in 2016, and engaging with materiality and historical references in different ways. Sakiyama Takayuki is from and currently based on the Izu Peninsula south of Tokyo, known for its dramatic coastal landscapes. With Shigaraki clay, he conjoins slabs into double-walled vessels. This is not wheel-thrown, as it may appear. What seem to be extremely thick walls are actually hollow inside. And he carefully incises a series of lines onto the surface in a very exacting manner. Sakiyama describes a concern with internal force radiating outward. Although he uses clay from one of Japan's oldest ceramic centers, Shigaraki, his vessels don't directly channel the style or techniques of Shigaraki ware. So they are, in this sense, quite innovative. And critics have compared the surface marks on his vessels to the raking of Zen dry rock gardens, as at Zuihoin that I just showed you. 3 years before making this vessel, Maita Akihiro became a living national treasure. Porcelain is the strongest form of ceramic that is vitrified or converted to glass under high temperatures of 1300 to around 1400 degrees Celsius, and made with a white fine-grade clay described in China in bodily terms of kaolin, the bone, and petunsa, the flesh. It's usually translucent and resonates like a bell when struck. Potters in the southern island of Japan, Kyushu, began making porcelain for elite patrons and the export market, much going to Europe, in the early 17th century onward. And a lot of it was highly decorated with underglazed blue and colorful overglaze enamels. Porcelain itself dates to about a millennium earlier in China. Notoriously difficult to work with, porcelain is described by Maita as something he initially fought with, but later he says he began to listen to its voice. Like Joseon Dynasty Korean potters, after throwing on the potter's wheel, he faceted the jar's outer surface, causing the form to bellow at the base and impart a balanced stability. He then applied a low-gloss translucent glaze before firing. And the results are, in his words, simple, modern, personal versions of white porcelain, termed hakuji in Japanese. Maita in the footsteps of the highly influential living national treasure from the 1950s, Tomimoto Kenkichi, who from the 1930s to 50s used the white porcelain vessel idiom to bring out the form, as he put it, in works that must not deceive, as he said. And he compared his white porcelain undecorated vessels to the fleshiness of sculptures by the modern French artist Aristide Maillol. But Tomimoto and others of the time were also clearly looking to spheroid Korean Joseon dynasty vessels made in the late 17th and 18th centuries and known today as moon jars or dalhangari, a genre appealing to the Korean elite's purist Neo-Confucian tastes for the frugal, modest, and honest, and widely collected by Mingei movement followers from the 1920s onward. Moon jars may have been used to store grain or fermented fish, rice wine, and so forth. And there's speculation that they may have also been used in ceremony. Note that this moon jar from the Joseon dynasty is of a much larger scale than the works on the right and bears a more opaline, comparatively matte surface. Maita's hakuji were on view last year at the Moa Museum, where the display evoked the luminescence of the moon against a night sky, a theme also illustrated on the right in a recent display of a Joseon moon jar at the National Museum of Korea. Next to tea vessels. Tea vessels comprise an important and very large category in Japanese ceramics history. So let's look at some containers for fresh water jars or mizusashi on the left and tea bowls on the right, made for use in the ritualized drinking of tea or chanoyu. Ceramic vessels are artfully combined with vessels of other mediums, such as bamboo, lacquer, and iron, as seen here in this commemoration of the anniversary of the death of one of the most famous tea masters, Senno Rikyu. Chanoyu, or the tea ceremony, emerged from Zen Buddhist monks, aristocrats, and military warlords of the 15th and 16th centuries, codifying how whipped green tea, or matcha, was consumed. And by the late 16th century, chanoyu tastes amongst military elites and wealthy merchants began to dictate ceramic production on a major scale in Japan, a production that emphasized simplicity, humbleness, irregularity, and stark beauty, or wabi. Note here the rust-brown freshwater jar on the lower part of the wooden shell and the black tea bowl on the tatami mat just in front of it. The host sits there on the left and prepares tea for the guest. Isezaki Jun and Kato Yasukage revived historical styles and achieved critical acclaim, not for rote facsimiles of historical objects, but for embracing esteemed approaches to materials and processes of the past that remain relevant in the present. These are great examples of the aesthetics of wheel throwing and glazing, each purposely leaving marks of interaction with wet clay. We see horizontal lines, recording fingers moving up the wall of the vessel. We see, particularly on the Kato Yasukage piece on the right, an upturned foot, sort of proving the vessel has been released from the potter's wheel. And we see on both undulating rims that appear to have been the result of the pots being casually jostled. Both of these vessels look rugged and convey a sense of gravity. Living national treasure Isezaki Jun created the jar on the left according to very local conditions that date to the 14th century. He says, "I was born in Bizen, I use Bizen clay, and I fire in a traditional Bizen anagama. From the wind and earth of Bizen surrounding my body, I think of ideas and create work drawn from the past." Bizen traditions for clay flavor, or tsuchi aji, which date to the 14th century, involve using local clay without glaze and firing, as I mentioned, in an anagama kiln, resulting in what's known as yakishime, conveying that the fire or yaki has tightened, shime, the clay. And his sentiments about local heritage are shared by many potters from various regions of Japan with long-standing histories of ceramics production. Kato Yasukage's orange and white shino glazed jar exemplifies one of the most well-known Japanese ceramic glazes, popular well beyond Japan. Shino is rich in feldspar, and it's got a telltale pitted mottled surface that varies from cloudy white to a sort of burnt marshmallow orange. The name Shino is perhaps due to the word shiro meaning white, or Shino might have been named after the tea master in the 16th century, Shino Soshin. And Shino wares developed at kilns in the region known as Mino in the late 16th century. Kondo Takahiro is the grandson of living national treasure Kondo Yuzo, but there is almost no discernible familial inheritance in terms of style or process. His table on the right is made with a process known as nirikomi, or kneaded clay, an effect achieved by combining two different colored clays, as we see here, and one which was used on the continent centuries earlier, as in other parts of the world. And here's just one example from the Goryeo dynasty in Korea. Kondo here adds a quite original technique for the glaze that he names ginteki, something that he formulated in the 1990s with dazzling drops of silver over glaze that kind of suggest waves and mist. He studied glass at the Edinburgh College of Art, and he says he uses fire in order to express water, as evoked by the silver beads. An important question arises with Kondo's bowl about use. Can or should it be used as a tea bowl? To use it as a tea bowl would require the use of a bamboo whisk inside, and what does one do with the rather impractical silver beads on the surface, we might say. And here the notion of an artwork for visual appreciation that arises from crafts, engagement with materials and processes is relevant. And it relates to a movement in Japan today that suggests the word for craft in Japanese, koge, should not be translated into English, because Japanese craft is defined by culturally specific attributes, particularly concerning the conceptualization of nature. As art historian Takashina Shuji has put it, in Japan, he says, people tend to think that nature completes what's made by humans, versus in the West, it's thought that human production completes what's found in nature. So that's one example of the type of statement that's put forth by proponents of koge not being translated into English because of these culturally specific attributes that many people believe are really important to acknowledge. Here's another example of glaze as expression. The artist here, Miwa Kyusetsu, was given the title Living National Treasure in 1983. He was the 11th generation head of the prestigious Hagi-ware family who made ceramics in the Edo period for the Choshu clan. Hagi-ware dates to the wartime Keicho era, when Korean potters were forcibly brought to Japan. They and their descendants produced favored tea utensils for wabi-style tea. Typical for Hagi-ware is its semi-opaque, thick white glaze that crackles, often to dramatic effect. We have another tea bowl by Miwa Kyusetsu in the Alfred Ceramic Art Museum that is quite similar. It comes from the Duxbury Museum in Massachusetts. And for that bowl as well as this one, what Miwa dubs as oni or devil hagi, is the descriptor that's shared. Let's end with a look at some of the sculptural works called objet in Japan. As I mentioned, a term arising in the 1950s and a major genre of Japanese ceramic expression today. Objets are generally of a scale that can be held and that would fit into a Japanese-style room's alcove for artistic objects, or tokonoma. On the right is a home building company's example of a Japanese-style room or washitsu that, if one wishes, it could be included into an otherwise Western-style designed house. Note that next to the tokonoma is a butsudan, an altar for paying respects and making offerings to deceased family members. The butsudan is not always next to a tokonoma, but we see it here. The artist who made the work on the left, Kurokawa Toru, has said, "I want to make something that looks like something you would find in a Japanese tokonoma, not like a Western sculpture." Born and based in Kyoto, Kurokawa received a BFA in sculpture and then a graduate degree in ceramics from Kyoto City University of Arts. He claims inspiration from various sources, from ancient earthenware that he describes as abstract art reflecting people's thoughts, to the modern sculptures of Isamu Noguchi and Yasuda Kan, in terms of how they use materials, and also, as he says, since there's something Japanese about their work. Much of Kurokawa's work involves a fascination with clay strings placed into patterns, something he credits with knitting and basket weaving as a child. He said he's interested in why forms exist, rather than wishing to imitate forms. And proliferation is a practice that proliferation is a theme he pursues in his practice. He says he wishes to follow a process similar to that of a plant growing through the expansion of details. With the work on the right, protocell E, he's referring to genetic material with permeable membranes that scientists investigating the earliest stages of life on Earth study. Futamura Yoshimi's sculpture, titled Big Birth, pushes clay's limits via trompe l'oeil. She applies porcelain clay slip to dark stonework clay in order to highlight creases and ruptures. And she fires works like this in her Paris studio's electric kiln. She speaks of a deep influence from nature, from something as small as a leaf falling on the street to as large as the triple disasters of 2011, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown at Fukushima. After that year, she said her work represented, quote, a fear of the uncertain, a force beyond our control, which threatens to extinguish everything, even the desire for rebirth. Clay mimicking natural materials can be found in 17th century teapots from Yixing in Jiangsu province, China, for example, and more recently here in a teapot by Taiwanese artist Ah Lian. Akiyama Yo emphasizes the process of, as he calls it, giving life to clay by responding to its constantly changing conditions. In this work, part of his Metavoid series, he explores relationships between planes and he juxtaposes smooth and fissured surfaces. His process often involves peeling clay or inverting thrown vessels, drawing our attention to the limits of malleability. Hashimoto Machiko was born in and works today in Kyoto, where she also studied at Kyoto Saga University of the Arts. She hand carves shigaraki porcelaneous stoneware and glazes her vessels with gosu blue pigment. Inspired by water and flowers, she says that she wants viewers to feel the motion and energy of carving in her sculptural vessels. And she's one of a number of leading women ceramists in Japan who are today working with flower forms. This is the last slide. Born in Osaka and like Maeda Akihiro, having graduated from the Osaka University of Arts Ceramic Craft Department, Shingu Sayaka has a studio practice in Kyoto. Her art engages with the material of clay outside of discernible historical references from the history of Japanese ceramics. When she was an artist in residence at the Shigaraki Toge no Mura, she got put into contact with ceramic artists from all over the world. And she credits that experience with inspiring her to work completely freely with the medium of clay. On the subject of being a woman working in the field of ceramics, she has said in recent years that there's some sort of connection between women working with clay due to its softness. Her process is to sculpt the clay in her fingers and rely on repetition. And here, what appear in the center portion as stamens are hundreds, maybe thousands of thin coils of clay she has twisted in her fingers over and over again. Cognizant of what for viewers will be a very particular sort of haptic sensation when they encounter it. What she said in a recent interview was beautiful. She's inspired, she says, by the relation of humans to flowers, that the fading and withering of flowers has its own strength. And that's why she chooses stoneware to which coloration such as black, as we see here, are added. So I'll conclude here with this message of strength that is a central theme of so much of the work in the exhibition. Artists are actively engaging in the works here with the dynamic elemental forces of nature in dialogue with the enduring past of ceramic art. These works invite us as viewers to contemplate our complex relationship to the earth. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating, Meghen, and it's so nice to hear your perspective on these works that have been in the gallery since, I guess, August. And I'll remind everyone in the audience that we will take some questions and are happy, and you just put them through chat and I'll read them out. But I in the meantime, I do have some questions for you. And what I find interesting, there's a couple of themes I want to talk about. One is the word objet or objet, and I find it interesting that it comes from from French and objet d'art, which I know exactly where that's coming from. But there's something sort of, I guess, derivative of that term, because it means decorative arts, applied arts, and it also means it's more diminutive. And so, but many of the sculptural pieces that are here on display in Hands and Earth are certainly not handheld objects. I don't see them as objet d'art. I see them as sculptural works. And, I know there's that hierarchy of language. So I wonder, do Japanese ceramic artists who, are working, for example, the artist who is making aggregate and protocell, right? Those are very, very large pieces, and they require at least two people to move them. I know that from our installation. So would they be comfortable with the term objet? They wouldn't consider it sort of critical or dismissive of their goals and aims?
That's a great question, Rachel. You know, objet is a term that some artists embrace, some artists do not. It gained currency in the 1950s when there was a paradigm shift in the field of Japanese ceramics, and artists associated with the Sodeisha movement were seeking to rebel against all the perceived norms of ceramic forms and processes, and they didn't want to have the burden of inheriting what came before. And these young men who were part of the Sodeisha group and whose work was first termed objet were all sons of pottery families. And so this was an act of rebellion to call the work objet. In recent years, let's see, from the 1980s onward, the term clay work became popular, and clay work was much more expansive in its meaning. Clay work as a term, kleiwaku in Japanese, could refer to very large scale and installation pieces as well. So it's a good point. You know, objet is a kind of shorthand that's useful, I think, still today when we're thinking about the particularities of so much Japanese sculpture that is relatively, I don't want to say small scale, but of a scale that can fit into a tokonoma, you know. And don't you think there's a kind of understood scale for a lot of artistic ceramics in the United States and Europe as well? Like, you can think about the popularity of vase forms as sort of showstopping pieces for people to.
Right. But a lot, I get that. But but a lot of the later work is not showing vase form at all, right? That's and they're showing, you know, pieces of nature. They're showing very expressive sculptural works that have broken away from the vessel form to some extent.
Right. I think there's what I'm trying to say is there's a kind of equivalency between what we could term an objet in a Japanese context and a decorative vase form, maybe in an American contemporary ceramic art context, in terms of a kind of established scale of production. But that would be an interesting question to pursue with individual artists. And I don't think all the artists in the exhibition would fully embrace this term.
All right.
But they would all understand its historical.
I'm going to move on now because that was my little pension. I do want you to talk about materiality, but we have a question from the audience from Erica, and she'd like to learn a little bit more about that, the term, the designation of living treasure in Japan, which was a term that was, you know, invented in the 1950s, right? So maybe you could expand on that for audiences.
Right. So in the aftermath of World War II, there was a widespread set of initiatives supported by the Japanese government to preserve and protect various forms of Japanese cultural heritage. And in the early 1950s, a scheme was drawn up to create a title for individuals in the world of craft called Juyo Muke Bunkazai Hojisha, which translates as holder of intangible, important cultural property. It's much easier to say Ningen Kokuho or living national treasure, as the title has become colloquially known. So from the mid-1950s onward, each year a select number of craft artists are given this title, and the award comes with a stipend. The stipend is, as I understand it, designated to allow the individual to take on students. And it's a really interesting system because the classifications vary widely. For example, Hamada Shoji was designated a living national treasure for Mingei ceramics. I think it was. So it's a little ambiguous what that means in terms of a particular style or material or so forth. Tomimoto Kenkichi was one of the first individuals who received the title, and that was for his overglazed enamel porcelain, a very specific style. Some individualistic potters rejected the title when they were offered at Kitoji Rosanjin, for example. And important to note in the world of ceramics is that to date, there has not been a single woman who has received that title, whereas other fields of craft have had women national treasure awards.
China has a similar designation, don't they, for living national artists? I would think they're very interested in supporting their intangible culture, right, and rewarding them.
I don't know the history of that. There's a similar system in Korea, but I think it in the East Asian context, I think the notion of a living national treasure, as it's conceived today, began in Japan.
Right. It's interesting this goes forward. Okay, so we have a question from Laura. She actually has two questions, and I think one is the first question, and Laura, I might be getting this wrong, is have any artworks come from or come into the traditional tea ceremony? So I guess the question is, are tea ceremonial objects considered works of art? Is the first question. And the second question, which I think we'll have to wrap up on, and I think I'd like you to focus on this a little bit. It's about the regionalism of kilns and how important they are. And when you think about that, Meghen, I think you can sort of think about how materiality is so important, because this is the theme of your talk as well and your essay, how kilns, materiality, regions are so critical to informing Japanese ceramics, whether it's Mingei or not Mingei. So first the tea bowl, then the as a work of art, and then the kilns and regionalism materialities.
Sure, there are a number of contemporary artists working in various mediums who have engaged with the tea ceremony as concept. Mariko Mori is an artist that comes to mind. The field of contemporary production is so vast when it comes to works that have something to do with the tea ceremony. Here at Alfred, in our Path of the Tea Bowl exhibition, we brought together works that are quite orthodox in being readily usable, for your bamboo whisk and for the preparation of matcha. But we included other works from Japan and beyond that defy or I should say, do not invite readily as much use. Kawata Takuro's massive tea bowl with a platinum glaze and a kind of exaggerated crackled surface is one example. But when you look closely at that, in contrast to the Peter Volkus tea bowl we have on display, Kawata's bowl has an interior that could hold liquid, right? Volkus's bowl has an S crack lodged right in the center of the base. You would not want to use that. So there's all sorts of really fascinating questions that contemporary makers, whether they're potters or artists working in other mediums, have engaged with regarding in terms of this very long-standing cultural practice that is associated with Japanese cultural identity, but which is practiced around the world today. And then as to the question about does each region have specific kilns, the map I showed at the beginning with Serizawa Keisuke's locating of regional rural kilns suggests that yes, indeed, each region has specific kilns. In actuality, over the centuries, some kilns have died down over time and then have been revived. It's a series of individual stories, really, but it's in central Honshu and then also in Kyushu where we find the most active production practices in Japan. Fewer regions in the north have long-standing kiln traditions. And that makes sense because, after all, it was in the ancient capital of Kyoto. And then when Tokyo became prominent in the Edo period, that central region throughout most of Japanese history has spawned the most consumption of ceramics.
Well, I feel like we could go on for a lot longer. I mean, it's just so fascinating listening to you both talk. And in preparing for this program, I thoroughly enjoyed hearing your thoughts and sort of delving into your research. So, Meghen, I want to thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation this evening, and for Rachel for adding a Crocker flavor to that. So thank you both, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that program as much as I did. Be sure to check out our website, crockerart.org, for our upcoming programs this spring, and have a great evening. See you again soon.